Imagine waking up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence that makes your skin prickle. The hum of streetlights is gone. The faint buzz of security cameras is missing. Even the comforting chirp of alarms that usually arm themselves at dawn has vanished. The neighborhood, once wrapped in a blanket of invisible protection, suddenly feels naked, vulnerable, exposed. At first, no one notices. The sun is still rising over the trimmed lawns and symmetrical driveways, spilling golden light across freshly washed cars. Kids are still rubbing their eyes and dragging their backpacks to waiting school buses. Joggers still make their morning laps, earbuds in, breaths misting in the cool air. On the surface, it is an ordinary suburban morning. But beneath that illusion, the system meant to keep everyone safe is already dead. Then the first flicker comes. A porch light sputters and dies. A motion-activated lamp clicks on and off, confused, before going dark completely. By mid-morning, a neighbor leans out of his front door, frowning at the unresponsive keypad of his alarm system. Across the street, another woman shakes her head at her garage camera, tapping it like a stubborn child's toy that won't work. One by one, the families of Oakwood Lane begin to realize that something is terribly wrong. And then, just as unease begins to spread, an unfamiliar car rolls slowly into the cul-de-sac. The windows are tinted, the license plate unfamiliar. It doesn't stop, doesn't wave, doesn't belong. It creeps around once, then twice before slipping away, leaving behind a trail of suspicion thicker than its exhaust fumes. Doors are checked twice that night. Curtains are drawn. Parents keep their children closer than usual. And the silence. The silence keeps growing louder. What none of them know, not yet, is that this collapse didn't come from a storm, or from faulty wiring, or even from a random accident. No, it was sabotage. A deliberate act, carried out in the shadows of a petty grudge. All it took was one bucket of paint, one restless night. And one woman who believed her obsession with neighborhood aesthetics outweighed the safety of every single family living there. Her name was Linda Matthews. To some, she was the tireless defender of property values. To others, she was the tyrant of the HOA, a woman who patrolled sidewalks with a clipboard, reported violations with glee, and treated minor imperfections like moral failures. But this time she went further. She climbed a ladder, crept across her neighbor's roof, and smeared thick black paint across solar panels that she'd decided were an eyesore. She thought she was teaching a lesson. She thought she was preserving beauty. What Linda didn't know was that those panels weren't just powering her neighbor's home. They weren't just keeping the lights on for one woman. They were powering something much bigger, the entire neighborhood's security system. Every camera, every alarm, every motion detector, all of it was tied to those gleaming panels on Evelyn Johnson's roof. And when Linda painted them over, when she blinded them with her brush strokes, she didn't just silence the technology. She silenced the neighborhood's sense of safety. She cracked open the door for real danger to walk right in. Now imagine it's your family, your home. Imagine realizing that the reason your cameras are dead, your lights are off, your security is gone, is because one neighbor's grudge over ugliness mattered more to her than your safety. What would you do? Would you stay silent for the sake of keeping peace? Or would you fight back knowing the enemy lives just next door? On Oakwood Lane, mornings usually smelled of fresh coffee, cut grass, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle drifting from backyard fences. It was the kind of suburban street that, at first glance, could have been plucked straight from a glossy real estate brochure. Lawns were trimmed like carpets, hedges sculpted into neat cubes, and mailboxes all painted the same soft shade of forest green, courtesy of the HOA's strict guidelines. To outsiders, Oakwood looked picture-perfect. But anyone who lived there knew the truth. Perfection came at a price. At the heart of Oakwood Lane stood Evelyn Johnson's home. Evelyn was 68 years old, a retired teacher with gentle eyes, and a voice that still carried authority when needed. She had lived there longer than almost anyone, having bought her house decades before the HOA even existed. To her, the neighborhood was more than a collection of tidy lawns. It was the community where she'd raised her children, where she'd planted her magnolia tree, where she intended to live out the rest of her years. And Evelyn was proud of her independence, proud of her resilience, and proudest of all of the solar panels glinting across her roof. She'd invested in them 5 years earlier, long before most of her neighbors understood how valuable they would become. At first, people whispered that they were ugly, out of place. But soon, everyone benefited from the decision Evelyn had made. Those panels didn't just power her home. They were wired into the neighborhood-wide security grid, a system designed to keep every family safe. For most, the panels faded into the background of daily life. They became part of the rhythm of Oakwood, lights that flicked on at dusk, cameras that blinked reassuringly at night, alarms that stood silent until they were needed. Few people ever thought about how much their safety depended on Evelyn's roof. But one woman noticed them every single day, and she hated them. Her name was Linda Matthews. Tall, sharp-featured, and always immaculately dressed, Linda had taken it upon herself to become Oakwood's unofficial enforcer. Technically, she was just the HOA secretary. In practice, she was the neighborhood watchdog, prowling the streets with her phone ready to snap photos of any violations. A recycling bin left out past pickup day. A lawn overgrown by half an inch. Christmas lights hung 2 days after New Year's. Nothing escaped Linda's notice, and nothing escaped her complaints. Linda told herself she was preserving property values. She claimed she wanted Oakwood to look like the brochures that first lured families here. But behind her tight smile and clipped emails was something else: control, power. The panels on Evelyn's roof represented the one thing Linda couldn't regulate, the one imperfection she couldn't erase. Neighbors often overheard her remarks, always delivered with that condescending edge. "They look so industrial," she'd say, "like a factory." Completely out of place here. At HOA meetings, she'd raise her hand, rehearsed speeches in tow. Curb appeal is everything. Buyers don't want to see machinery. She never said Evelyn's name directly, but everyone knew who she meant. Evelyn, for her part, refused to be intimidated. She'd sit calmly through Linda's tirades, hands folded, eyes steady. And when the meeting adjourned, she'd go home, look up at her panels gleaming in the sun, and smile. Evelyn had lived long enough to know that progress always drew critics. What mattered wasn't how it looked. What mattered was what it did, and what it did was keep Oakwood safe. Still, the tension simmered. Neighbors began to notice the way Linda glared at Evelyn's house when she walked her dog, the way her lips tightened whenever she passed the panels. A few joked about it. She probably dreams about painting those things at night, but behind the laughter was unease. Everyone knew Linda had a temper. Everyone knew she liked getting her way. On the surface, Oakwood was calm. Children rode bicycles down the street. Couples hosted weekend barbecues. Cars gleamed in driveways, and sprinklers clicked rhythmically against the grass. But like a painting with cracks beneath the varnish, something was beginning to split, and Evelyn could feel it. She could feel it in the way Linda lingered too long near her house, in the way conversations hushed when she entered a room, in the way the neighborhood seemed divided, some siding with Evelyn's quiet strength, others bending under Linda's scrutiny. One evening, as Evelyn sat on her porch sipping tea, she watched Linda walk by. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air seemed to thicken. Linda didn't wave, didn't smile. She just stared at the panels, her face pinched with disdain, before turning sharply and walking away. Evelyn set her teacup down, her chest tightening. She told herself it was nothing, just another look, just another silent judgment. But deep down she knew. She knew Linda's hatred wasn't just idle annoyance anymore. It was something sharper. Something dangerous. The panels caught the last light of the setting sun, glowing like shields across Evelyn's roof. She didn't know it yet, but those shields were already marked. And soon, someone would take aim at them. It happened on a night when the air was still and heavy, the kind of night where every sound carries just a little too far. Most of Oakwood slept peacefully under their neatly pressed quilts. unaware that a storm, not of weather, but of choice, was about to break over their quiet street. Linda Matthews had been waiting for this moment. For weeks, her frustration had been gnawing at her, turning into something almost unbearable. Every morning she would walk her dog past Evelyn Johnson's house. Every afternoon she would drive home beneath the sharp gleam of those solar panels. And every evening she would catch their reflection out of the corner of her eye, like a constant reminder of defiance. To Linda, they weren't just panels. They were proof that someone, Evelyn of all people, could resist her authority. That those rules, those guidelines she recited at every HOA meeting, weren't ironclad. And Linda couldn't stand it. She had told herself that she was protecting the community, preserving beauty, maintaining standards. But beneath that polished excuse was a darker truth. Linda hated not getting her way. So when the neighborhood grew quiet and the last porch lights flicked off, Linda slipped out of her back door. She wore black, jeans, gloves, a hoodie pulled tightly around her head. In her hands, she carried a bucket of thick tarry paint and a long-handled roller. She looked less like a homeowner and more like a thief, and perhaps in some ways that was exactly what she had become. She crossed the lawn quickly, her eyes darting left and right. The cul-de-sac was asleep, or so she thought. Curtains hung still. No car engines hummed, no voices drifted through the night. Only the crickets filled the silence, chirping like 1,000 tiny alarms that no one could hear. Dragging the ladder from behind Evelyn's shed, she positioned it against the roof. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with a kind of electric exhilaration. Each rung she climbed felt like victory, each step bringing her closer to erasing the sight that had tormented her for years. When she reached the top, she balanced precariously, dipping the roller into the bucket and lifting it toward the panels. The paint clung thickly, black and glossy under the moonlight. With one long stroke, she smeared it across the first panel, watching the reflective surface disappear beneath the darkness. A twisted smile tugged at her lips. Better already, she thought, cleaner, sharper, like it should be. Stroke after stroke, panel after panel, she worked methodically. To Linda, it felt like order being restored, like balance returning to Oakwood Lane. She imagined the next HOA meeting, imagined herself standing tall as neighbors applauded the sudden disappearance of the eyesore. They would thank her. They would finally see she had been right all along. But in her self-satisfaction, Linda didn't stop to consider what those panels actually did. She didn't stop to wonder why Evelyn's house seemed untouched by rising utility bills, or why the neighborhood security system never faltered. She didn't think of the cameras, the alarms, the network that tied every home together like veins carrying blood. No, Linda was too blinded by her own obsession to see that every brushstroke was severing those veins. By the time she climbed down, the panels were unrecognizable. The moonlight no longer glinted off them. Instead, they lay buried under a suffocating coat of black. Linda wiped her gloved hands on her jeans, smirked in satisfaction, and disappeared back into her house, the empty bucket swinging at her side. The crime went unnoticed for a few hours. Evelyn, a light sleeper, stirred once when she thought she heard footsteps outside, but she told herself it was nothing more than a raccoon. She returned to bed, unaware that her home had been violated, that her careful investment, her shield for the neighborhood, had been crippled. Morning came bright and sharp. Evelyn stepped onto her porch with her usual cup of tea, savoring the cool air before the sun climbed too high. It wasn't until she glanced upward, as she often did, that her breath caught in her throat. Her panels were ruined. Black paint dripped in uneven streaks across the glass, pooling at the edges, congealing like tar. The proud, gleaming shields she had polished and protected for years now looked like tombstones. Buried under a vandal's rage, her teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the porch steps. At first, Evelyn couldn't move. She stood frozen, her chest tight, her throat dry. Who could have done this? Why? She felt suddenly exposed, not just as a homeowner, but as a person, as though the attack wasn't on the panels, but on her very dignity. And deep down, she already knew who to blame. Linda, The thought came sharp, immediate, undeniable. Evelyn could see her neighbor's scowling face in her mind, could hear her clipped voice railing against ugliness and standards. She felt the sting of every side comment, every backhanded remark, every glare that had passed between them. It all led here. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to shout, to storm across the street, to demand an explanation. But something in her told her to wait, to think, to understand what had been taken from her before she confronted it. She didn't know it yet, but the sabotage was bigger than her pride, bigger than her property, because those panels didn't just power her home. They powered the neighborhood's lifeline. And by the time Oakwood discovered what had been lost, the damage would already be spiraling, far beyond a single act of vandalism. At first, the consequences seemed almost invisible. Evelyn stood on her porch that morning, staring at the vandalized panels, trying to collect herself. She called the police to report the destruction, but they filed it as property damage with no sense of urgency. They promised a patrol car would drive by when available. Evelyn knew what that meant. Nothing would happen any time soon. She tried calling the solar company, but they told her the panels would need to be completely stripped and resurfaced. Thousands of dollars. Weeks of work. Evelyn pressed a hand to her forehead as she hung up, trying to fight off the dread creeping up her spine. And then, around dusk, the first flicker came. At number 24 Oakwood Lane, the Johnsons' security lights blinked twice and then went out, leaving their driveway in sudden darkness. At number 27, a home camera sputtered, then fell silent, its little red light vanishing. By 9 o'clock, half the block was calling their alarm company. The operator's response was always the same. Our system shows loss of power input to your neighborhood grid. Please check with your HOA for information. By midnight, the phones were ringing non-stop. Neighbors poured onto their porches in their slippers and robes, staring at the street with unease. The familiar glow of security lights that once bathed the cul-de-sac in safety had been replaced by shadows. Some muttered to themselves, others cursed at their dead control panels, while a few tried to laugh it off, but fear was already taking root. "Did you hear about the break-ins last year, 3 neighborhoods over?" whispered Mrs. Ramirez, clutching her robe tighter. "They waited for systems to go down, then hit 5 houses in one night. My cameras are out," shouted Mr. Howard, his voice trembling. "Completely dead. What if someone tries something?" It didn't take long for the speculation to turn into blame, and all eyes landed on Evelyn's house. She sat quietly on her porch, shoulders hunched as the whispers grew louder. She didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to admit what she knew deep down, that her panels had been sabotaged, that this wasn't an accident. But when she finally spoke, her words cut through the night like glass. Someone painted over them. The crowd gasped, voices overlapping in confusion. Painted? Who would do that? Why, that's insane. And then, from somewhere near the back, came the voice Evelyn had expected all along. Smooth, clipped, dripping with false innocence. Maybe they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. Linda Matthews stood with her arms crossed, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her phone. Her words weren't loud, but they carried, slicing through the murmurs like a knife. Neighbors turned, their expressions torn between shock and reluctant agreement. After all, hadn't Linda been complaining about those panels for years? Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to stand, to accuse Linda outright, but how could she prove it? There were no cameras now, no witnesses, just suspicion. As the night deepened, the tension only worsened. People triple-locked their doors. Some dragged patio chairs into their driveways to keep watch. The once pristine cul-de-sac now looked like a camp under siege, shadows shifting nervously behind curtained windows. Inside her own house, Evelyn paced. Her heart ached not just with anger but with guilt. She had been proud of her panels, proud that they kept everyone safe. Now, with them ruined, she felt as though she had failed the very neighbors she'd tried to protect, and Linda. She slept soundly, or so she told herself. Yet in the quiet of her room, her phone buzzed with messages from other board members. "Did you hear what happened? The system's down. This could turn into a liability issue." Linda typed back calmly, her fingers steady. "I warned you all about those panels. This is why we shouldn't let people do whatever they want." But even as she pressed send, she felt a twist of unease in her stomach. She had wanted to humiliate Evelyn, to rid the neighborhood of what she saw as an eyesore. She had not intended for the entire security system to fail. By morning, Oakwood Lane was buzzing with unrest. Cars lined the street as technicians arrived, scratching their heads at the sabotage. A police cruiser finally showed up, its flashing lights reflecting off the blackened panels. Neighbors gathered again, voices sharp, accusations flying. The HOA called an emergency meeting that evening. Evelyn attended, though her hands trembled as she walked into the clubhouse. The air inside was heavy, filled with frustration and suspicion. "This can't go on," shouted one neighbor. "My kids didn't sleep a wink last night. We need those cameras back." "Whoever did this," another said, "put all of us in danger. This wasn't just vandalism. This was reckless." Evelyn stood slowly, her voice steady despite the fear knotting in her chest. "This wasn't random. Someone wanted to silence those panels. Someone wanted me silenced?" Gasps echoed across the room. All eyes turned again to Linda. She sat rigid, her smile brittle, fingers tapping the table. But Linda wasn't ready to be exposed. Not yet. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone dripping with false concern. "Evelyn, maybe it's time to admit that those panels were never in compliance. Maybe this is a sign that—" Her words were cut off by a sudden sound outside, a car alarm blaring in the night. Then another. The room fell into stunned silence as people scrambled toward the windows. The alarms weren't warning anyone. They were malfunctioning. The system had gone haywire, shrieking into the night without control. And for the first time, the neighbors realized, without Evelyn's panels, Oakwood Lane wasn't just unsafe. It was vulnerable. The alarms didn't stop. What began as a few isolated blares quickly became a chorus of shrieks echoing through Oakwood Lane. Car horns blared at random. Security sirens wailed into the night, and porch lights flickered like strobe beams across the cul-de-sac. Parents rushed to calm crying children. Dogs barked wildly in their yards, and frantic voices rose above the chaos. Neighbors poured into the street. Their once pristine sanctuary transformed into something unrecognizable. It wasn't safety anymore. It was panic. "Cut the wires," someone shouted, fumbling with their alarm box. "It won't reset," yelled another, slamming their phone against their palm after yet another dead call to the alarm company. Evelyn stood in the middle of it all, her heart pounding in her ears. This was the nightmare she'd feared, the second she'd seen her panels dripping with paint. She watched families stagger under the weight of fear, watched children cling to their parents, watched the block crumble in a way she'd never imagined. And then came the worst blow of all. A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, its siren competing with the cacophony. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the scene with tense expressions. Evelyn hurried toward them, relief flooding her chest. Finally, someone to restore order. But the officer in charge shook his head. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. The city system flagged this neighborhood as compromised. Power irregularities, false alarms, and now failed emergency signals. Dispatch is rerouting priority calls. You're at the bottom of the list until the system stabilizes." The words hit harder than a slap. Evelyn staggered back. "You mean, if something really happens?" The officer's eyes softened with pity. "You're on your own." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the words spread. Oakwood Lane, the neighborhood that prided itself on safety, on order, on control, had just been abandoned. The panic turned into fury. "This is your fault," someone shouted at Evelyn. "Those panels were your responsibility." "She did this on purpose," another muttered darkly. "We never should have let her set up that system." Evelyn's face burned. She wanted to scream, to tell them she had given them years of safety, that she had fought for them, that she had sacrificed for them. But the mob wasn't ready to listen. Fear had already warped into blame, and she was the easiest target. Linda watched from the edge of the crowd, her arms folded tightly. Her heart thumped hard against her ribs. She had wanted humiliation for Evelyn, yes. She had wanted the old woman to feel small, powerless. But this was a disaster, a backfire. She hadn't expected the police to pull back. She hadn't expected the whole block to descend into chaos. And as the voices grew louder, as fingers pointed sharper, she felt a prickle of dread creep down her spine, because the more people blamed Evelyn, the closer they would get to the truth that someone had destroyed those panels. And Linda knew she couldn't hide forever. The breaking point came just after midnight. A scream tore through the street. A teenager from down the block, running breathless, shouting words that froze everyone where they stood. "Break in." At number 19, the crowd erupted. People sprinted toward the house. Others scrambled for their phones, though they knew the calls wouldn't go through. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The worst had happened. The system had failed, and predators had noticed. They found the Ramirez family huddled on their porch, shaken but unharmed. Someone had jimmied their back gate, tried the door, then fled when the family screamed. But the damage was done. Oakwood wasn't just vulnerable in theory anymore. It was under attack. Fear turned into outright hysteria. Neighbors dragged furniture to block their doors. Others stayed awake with baseball bats in their hands. The idyllic cul-de-sac had become a fortress of paranoia, every shadow a threat, every noise a warning. Through it all, Evelyn sat on her porch, staring at the ruined panels. Her chest ached with guilt so heavy it was hard to breathe. This wasn't just vandalism anymore. This was war, and someone, she knew who, had lit the match. But what Evelyn didn't realize was that Linda's carefully hidden role was already starting to unravel. A neighbor swore they'd seen someone in black moving near Evelyn's roof the night before. Another mentioned the paint smudges near Linda's trash can. And when whispers of suspicion began to coil through the air, they didn't drift toward Evelyn anymore. They drifted toward Linda. By dawn, Oakwood Lane was no longer the same. It was broken. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Fear sat heavy in every house. And the illusion of safety, the illusion Linda had claimed to protect, had collapsed entirely. And in the silence after the chaos, Evelyn whispered to herself, not as a plea but as a promise. This isn't over. The HOA clubhouse had never been this full. Folding chairs lined every wall. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, and the air buzzed with nervous energy. Word had spread quickly. The alarms, the attempted break-in, the police pulling back. Oakwood Lane had reached its breaking point, and everyone knew tonight's meeting would decide the future. At the front table sat the board, but all eyes gravitated toward two women, Evelyn Johnson, her shoulders straight but her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and Linda Matthews, immaculate as always in her pressed blouse and pearls, a picture of composure that looked just a little too polished. The room quieted as the HOA president, Mr. Whitaker, cleared his throat. "We're here to address the crisis that's put this neighborhood in danger. The security grid has failed. Families are scared, and we need answers." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man from the back shouted, "Start with the panels." All heads turned toward Evelyn. She rose slowly, her cane tapping against the floor as she steadied herself. Her voice, though weary, carried the same authority she'd once used to quiet classrooms full of restless children. "My panels were not the problem," she said firmly. "They were the solution. For years they kept us safe. For years they gave us power, literally and figuratively. Someone took that away from us. Someone decided to destroy them. And that someone put every single one of us in danger." Gasps echoed through the room. The word hung heavy. Destroy. Evelyn's eyes swept the room before settling, sharp and unflinching, on Linda. "You all know who's hated those panels from the start." A wave of whispers rose. Neighbors turned, glancing at Linda, some nodding, others frowning. Linda stood gracefully, lifting her chin, her voice dripping with controlled indignation. "This is ridiculous. I've raised concerns, yes, because those panels violated our HOA's appearance code. But vandalism, that's a serious accusation. Do you really think I would sneak onto someone's roof in the middle of the night like a criminal?" Evelyn didn't blink. "Yes, I do," the room erupted. Shouts, arguments, gasps. Some neighbors defended Evelyn, pointing to Linda's years of complaints. Others shook their heads, unwilling to believe the elegant woman before them could stoop so low. Then came the twist that changed everything. From the side of the room, young Daniel Ramirez, the teenager who had sounded the alarm during the attempted break-in, raised his hand. His voice cracked, but his words were steady. "I saw someone on Evelyn's roof that night, dressed in black, carrying a bucket." The crowd froze. All eyes whipped back to Linda. Linda's smile faltered for the first time. That could have been anyone. Teenagers pulling pranks. Delivery workers? No, Daniel interrupted. It was you. I saw your face when the hood slipped. I didn't want to say anything at first, but after what happened at our house, his voice trembled. You nearly got my family hurt. The silence was suffocating. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to vanish. Linda's mask cracked. Her composure slipped, replaced by a flicker of desperation. This is absurd. He's a child. You're really going to take the word of a scared teenager over mine? But the whispers were no longer whispers. They were accusations. I saw black paint on her trash bin. She's always hated Evelyn's panels. She did say they ruined curb appeal. The tide was turning, and Linda knew it. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. Evelyn took a step closer, her cane tapping firmly. You didn't just try to erase me, Linda. You erased our safety. You put every family here at risk. For what? So the neighborhood would look a little prettier in your eyes? Linda's face flushed red. This place was falling apart. Rules matter. Order matters. Without them, we're nothing but chaos. Her voice cracked under the weight of her own rage. The irony was too sharp to miss. The chaos Linda had feared, the chaos she claimed to prevent, had been unleashed by her own hands. Neighbors shook their heads, their eyes hardening. The murmurs grew louder, angrier, until finally the HOA president banged his gavel. Enough, Mr. Whitaker said, his voice shaking with fury. He turned to Linda. Your actions, if proven, go beyond an HOA violation. They're criminal. You will answer for this. Linda opened her mouth to protest, but the crowd was no longer on her side. People stood, pointing, voices rising in a swell of condemnation. For the first time, Linda Matthews, the self-appointed queen of Oakwood Lane, found herself drowning in the voices of those she once controlled, and Evelyn, though weary, stood taller. For the first time in days, the weight on her chest eased. The truth was surfacing. Justice was near. But even as the meeting erupted into chaos, Evelyn knew the story wasn't over. Linda wasn't the kind of woman to bow out quietly. And in Oakwood Lane, the fight was only just beginning. The morning after the HOA meeting, Oakwood Lane was quieter than anyone could remember. No children pedaled their bikes down the street. No lawnmowers buzzed to life. Even the birds seemed muted, as though the whole block was holding its breath. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Johnson's house, the ruined panels still coated in black paint, standing like scars against the sky. Yet inside, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in days, a flicker of strength. The tide had turned. The truth was out, even if justice hadn't yet been delivered. By noon, squad cars rolled onto Oakwood Lane. 2 uniformed officers knocked on Linda Matthews' door. Curtains fluttered in neighboring houses as residents peeked out, breathless with anticipation. Linda answered the door in her crisp blouse and pearls. But her smile faltered when the officers read her the charges: trespassing, vandalism, property destruction, and reckless endangerment. Gasps echoed up and down the block as Linda was led to the cruiser. Her protests carried through the air. This is outrageous. I was protecting property values. This neighborhood owes me. But they fell flat. For the first time, the woman who had lorded over everyone was powerless. Her words nothing more than desperate excuses. Evelyn stood on her porch, her cane steady in her hand, and watched as Linda was driven away. She didn't gloat, didn't shout. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that balance had finally been restored. The irony was almost too rich. Linda had spent years trying to control Oakwood in the name of order, and in the end, she had plunged it into chaos. Chaos that now defined her legacy. But the story didn't end with Linda's arrest. The community still had to heal. The panels still had to be restored. And Evelyn still had to decide whether she wanted to remain the silent guardian of Oakwood or step into a louder, more public role. The answer came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, a group of neighbors appeared on her porch. The Ramirez family, the Howards, even Mr. Whitaker himself. They carried coffee, casseroles, and envelopes stuffed with donations. "Evelyn," Mr. Ramirez said, his voice thick with emotion, "we were wrong to doubt you. You gave us safety for years, and we let one person's bitterness blind us. We want to help fix this, together." Evelyn's throat tightened as she looked at the envelopes, the casseroles, the earnest faces of the people she had fought so hard to protect. She had always carried the burden alone, proud of her independence. But in that moment, she realized strength didn't always mean standing alone. Sometimes it meant letting others stand beside you. Repairs began within the week. Neighbors volunteered their time, some climbing onto the roof to scrape away the paint, others helping the solar technicians rewire the damaged grid. What had once been a symbol of division, those glinting panels, became a symbol of unity. Oakwood Lane was no longer just Evelyn's responsibility. It was everyone's. And when the lights finally flickered back to life, when the cameras blinked red and the alarms hummed back into readiness, the neighborhood erupted in cheers. Children clapped, parents hugged, and Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest that no amount of sabotage could erase. Justice didn't just come in Linda's downfall. Justice came in reversal, the humiliation she had suffered flipping into triumph, the isolation she had endured transforming into community. As for Linda, her story became the cautionary tale whispered at every block party, every backyard barbecue. Parents warned their children, "Don't let bitterness consume you. Don't be like Linda." Her house sat empty, her once perfect lawn overgrown. The queen of Oakwood Lane had been dethroned, and in her absence something stronger had risen. Not fear, not control, but solidarity. On a cool evening weeks later, Evelyn sat once again on her porch, tea steaming in her hands. She gazed up at the panels, gleaming once more in the fading sun, and allowed herself a small smile. She had been tested, humiliated, and nearly broken. But she had endured, and in the end she hadn't just survived Linda's attack. She had become something greater because of it, and Oakwood Lane, her Oakwood Lane, was finally safe again. Months passed, and Oakwood Lane slowly settled into its new rhythm. The HOA still met, but the tone was different now, less about rules and regulations, more about community and cooperation. Without Linda's iron grip, neighbors discovered something shocking. They actually liked each other. Sivelyn Johnson became something of a legend. Children waved when they saw her walking with her cane. Parents greeted her with gratitude that went beyond politeness. She was no longer just the old woman with the solar panels. She was Oakwood's quiet protector, the one who had endured betrayal and humiliation and still stood tall. But legends have a way of stirring unease. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn sat on her porch sipping her tea. The panels above her gleamed, catching the last light of day. The neighborhood seemed at peace, children laughing in the distance, porch lights flickering on one by one. Then her phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security system, newly restored and stronger than ever. A camera at the far end of the street had picked up movement. Evelyn opened the feed, expecting to see a stray dog or a wandering raccoon. What she saw instead made her blood run cold. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the neighborhood, half hidden in shadow. The camera's infrared caught the glint of something metallic, maybe a bucket, maybe something else. The figure didn't move. It just watched. Evelyn's heart pounded. She zoomed the feed, but the face was too blurred to make out. All she knew was that someone was out there, waiting. For a long moment she stared at the screen, then at the panels above her, then back at the peaceful street before her. The neighborhood was safe, yes, but safety, she realized, was never permanent. It had to be guarded, renewed, fought for again and again. She closed the app, set her phone down, and took another slow sip of her tea. Let them come. she murmured to herself. This time, we're ready. The camera feed froze on the still figure at the edge of the street, as though daring viewers to decide for themselves. Was it Linda, returned to reclaim her crown? Or someone new, another Karen waiting in the wings? And more importantly, what would you do if it was your neighborhood? The screen faded to black. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, imagine living in a neighborhood like this. What would you do if someone sabotaged your safety just to protect their ego? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you love seeing justice served with a twist, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We've got more true HOA Karen dramas, betrayal stories, and real-life revenge arcs coming your way. And trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay sharp, and remember, sometimes the biggest battles are fought right outside your front door.